Okay. So here I'm going to be talking about the homework assignment. That's to compare and contrast two papers. Just make sure I'm recording. I am. Okay. Um, and so it might be helpful if you have not looked at the previous video where I try to explain briefly what structural case is in different languages. Might be worth looking at that briefly because the two papers I picked are going to be about learning case systems in a second language. So this is sort of a neat topic that's has one foot in basic linguistics and one foot in applied linguistics, but it might help if you know what case is. It's a kind of grammatical feature of different languages. Okay, so here's the assignment. I want you to pick two papers in your field, preferably on at least a somewhat similar topic, right? So they should be somehow related in what they're dealing with. And this can be, again, in the thing you looked at week one, you can use that paper as one of the two if you want to, or if you want to maybe look into something slightly more specific or on a slightly different topic, that's also fine. Just find two papers on something you're interested in, and we're going to compare and contrast their structures. Minimal elements here. You have to tell me what the papers are, and I'll illustrate that in a second. Where'd you get the papers? Who wrote them? That kind of stuff. And then talk about the structures of the two papers. Are they similar or different? What's the same? What's different? And then here's the sort of hard one. Why do you think the things that are shared, or why do you think that the things that are different are different? Right? And then finally, I'm also looking for maybe your assessment of how you thought these structures worked. So what do you like or dislike about the way the two papers were organized? Would you change things in order to improve the organization of the papers? Which one's easier to read? Right? Which one did you find better organized? Which one do you believe more? Why? Why do you think one of them is better than the other, if you do? And then imagine that you're going to write a paper on this topic. How would you structure it? What would you include minimally? Like what are the necessary things here, and why do you think that? So these are all sort of questions getting at what's the right way to organize a paper. What do readers find it easier or harder to process? What are you trying to accomplish when you write a research paper? So here are the papers I picked. One of them is by Kempe and McWhinney, and it's about the acquisition of case marking by adult learners of Russian and German. And this comes from a peer-reviewed journal in second language acquisition, which you can think of as being somewhere in between basic and applied linguistics. And then the second one is by Artoni and Magnani, and it's about a particular kind of grammatical theory called lexical functional grammar, and how that theory can contribute in second language acquisition research, the development of case in second language Russian or foreign language learners of Russian. This one is not in a peer-reviewed journal. It's in a book that has the proceedings of a particular conference. And so on the hierarchy of like academic prestige and how much we think these different kinds of publications are difficult to publish, probably the peer-reviewed journal here is going to be a little bit higher profile than the conference proceedings, but these are both work that's going to be reliable, that was done by professionals, that was presented to other professionals at the conference. Now, these proceedings may or may not be peer-reviewed in terms of the actual written paper. Some conferences do, some conferences don't, but at a minimum, they're going to have been presented to audience members at the conference. And so if they're totally crazy or incompetent findings, probably those will have been weeded out at the conference, right? So in terms of the format of these references, I'm using roughly the APA style, American Psychological Association, for references. And that's a good place to sort of base your references on. Some teachers and some journals and some areas and fields care a lot about the specific ways that you use like punctuation in these references. So like you have to have the last name first for the first author, but you can either have first name, first initial, or full first name. There needs to be a period here and parentheses here. This part should be in italics, and then you want to bold the issue number, and there should be a comma here. You need to specify the last name of the editors or the first name. Lots and lots of little details like this that some people care a lot about. I do not care So for this class, if I can find the paper that you're talking about, that's what I care about. Beyond that, the punctuation of references is, in my opinion, not something worth thinking about. It actually, I find it quite frustrating when people nitpick about the way that you've organized your references. The point of a reference is for somebody who's reading the paper to be able to find the previous research that you're talking about. If they can find it, then the reference succeeds. That said, in life, you will run into situations where proper formatting in APA style is super, super important. And for people who are studying more sort of language or humanistic type topics, you might also find a slightly different format, which is the Modern Language Association, or MLA format, is preferred in some places. I'm less conversant in that format, but in general, there are standard ways to present these references. For this class, give me enough information so that I can find the paper, and I'm happy. Okay, here's the sort of overarching structures of the two papers. I've got the Kempian-McWhinney paper from the Studies in Second Language Acquisition Journal over here, the Artonian-Magnani one from the conference proceedings over here, and we'll start here. So the Kempian-McWhinney paper has an abstract. This is a paragraph at the beginning that gives a very concise summary of what the paper is about, what it finds, and what you think the main conclusions are. Not all journals have abstracts, but most of them do nowadays. The Kempian-McWhinney paper is going to have an introduction section that happens to be unlabeled. They don't have a heading that says introduction, but there's all these sections that are giving you background and framing the studies, and I consider that an introduction, right? So they have a whole bunch of more specific background sections on, hey, how do people learn inflectional paradigms? Inflectional paradigms are ways of grammatically changing certain categories of words in different languages. Could be things like verbs and tense, or nouns and gender, or in this case, different words and the structural case that they bear. What is second language learning like? What's our approach to cross-linguistic variability? And so on and so forth, right? So lots of background information in here, and then also about how we're going to approach the quantitative aspects of our study. And then there's one empirical study, a second empirical study, and then finally there's a general discussion. Right? So this is roughly the four-part organization. Artoni and Magnani have an abstract just like the other paper. They have a short introduction that says a few things about the paper, and then there's a whole series of other background sections about the theories they're using of both processing and grammar, about what Russian case looks like, and what we're going to talk about for developmental or learning hypotheses. Then we're going to test those hypotheses, and then we're going to give you our conclusion. Right? So at a first pass, these two structures look fairly different, but actually, when you recognize that Artoni and Magnani really have an introduction that has these other background sections inside it, well, now they look actually rather similar. So all of these things, the background on the theories they're using and the Russian case system, really are sort of subsections of the introduction, even though that's not the way they numbered the paper. It's still pretty clearly what's going on here. And so now these are both looking pretty similar. We're going to have the introduction. We're going to have some description of the study that tests these, or in this case, two studies, and then we're going to discuss the results, right? So zooming in a little bit more on the Kempian-McWhinney paper, there's two different studies here, and if you look inside each of those two studies, you find, oh, look at that. It's basically the classical four-part format, just repeated twice for each of the studies. So each study is also going to have an introduction, a methods section, a results section, and then discussing those results. Now, the second study, interestingly, isn't a study on people. It's a study on a computer simulation of how people behave. And so it's going to have the same parts, except the methods section here is going to talk about the computational structure of the simulation that we're doing. The results section is going to tell you, hey, what did the model do once we programmed in it this way? And of course, they're going to be interested in how well does this match what real people did in the first experiment that we looked at. And then again, a discussion. So really, this is a sort of bigger and more expansive paper that has a couple of these four-part organizations, intro, methods, results, discussion, embedded inside one another. But it's still some variant of that classical four-part format. What are the papers for? In order to know how the different structures here relate to the purposes of the paper, we need to say something about what the papers are trying to do. So Kempe and McWhinney are going to argue that one set of constructs that they refer to as Q validity plays a larger role than another set of constructs, which they call paradigm complexity, in explaining how different foreign language learners at different levels of proficiency acquire case systems. More generally, they're going to argue that this kind of second language acquisition is better modeled by a particular kind of computational framework, which is emergentist, associationist, and connectionist, than it is by a more grammar-based, rationalist, modular framework. So each of these specific terms has a host of things that go along with them. But this is, even without understanding what any of the specific terminology is about here, you can see they're testing two different theories of how foreign language learners will get case in a foreign language. The two theories rely on different constructs, and they're going to argue that one of them does better than the other. Right? Now, in particular, Q validity refers to basically, given some linguistic form that you're hearing in a foreign language, how easy is it to recover what the structure of the sentence was from the actual form that you hear. Paradigm complexity refers to something a little bit different, which is just how many different categories of stuff are there in the grammatical system. And so these are going to be related but distinct concepts of what it means for a case system to be hard or to be complex. And then I'll talk a little bit about associationism and versus rationalism later on in these slides. Artoni and Magnani are trying, on the other hand, to show that a particular theory of second language acquisition, which they call processability theory, when you couple it with a detailed theory of grammatical structure, which is lexical functional grammar, or LFG, that these two things together make some novel and kind of surprising predictions about how foreign learners ought to learn Russian case, and that those predictions are right, that these are correct predictions. More generally, they're trying to show that detailed theories of grammar are helpful in understanding second language acquisition, which is in some ways almost the opposite of this Kempe and McWhinney paper, where they're saying that these computational associationist models do better than grammar-based ones. Artoni and Magnani are trying to show that detailed theories of grammar are helpful in understanding second language acquisition. And then put in parentheses here, maybe they're trying to show that lexical functional grammar is the right theory of syntax or the right theory of mental grammar, but this is a little bit less clear to me, and I'll talk about that later as well. So these are basically what the papers are trying to do. And here's some differences. And for each of these differences that I list here, I'm going to try to give you a range of different reasons you might have for the differences, where I'm going to start with very surfacey obvious ones, which are perfectly fine for this assignment. We're all just getting started at reading research. I'm going to give you a sort of medium level of complexity that does a little bit of speculating about why they might have organized the papers this way in terms of their actual theoretical approaches. And then I'm going to give you a least obvious category, where these are really quite sort of speculative and high-level ideas about the sociological structure of the field, where I don't expect anybody to have these kinds of generalizations at their fingertips, but I'm trying to show you how you can build on gaining knowledge of sort of simpler and more surface clear aspects of paper structure to actually get at some interesting and much less concrete observations about why the papers look the way they look, right? So you don't have to be producing these kinds of insights in your homework, but I did want to give an example of how a professional researcher might be approaching the connections between structure and content in these papers. Okay, so obvious differences. Kempe and McWhinney have more than one study section. They have two studies, right? Here's the obvious explanation: because they performed more than one study, and Artoni and Magnani did not. They only performed one study. That's pretty obvious. Yeah, but what can we conclude from that? Well, less obvious, because they have different purposes here. Kempe and McWhinney are trying to supplement their broad empirical conclusion, which is that connectionism is better, with not only experimental data, but also with hard proof that a specific connectionist computer program can capture some interesting aspects of the data. Right? So they have an experiment where they show how people behave, but they also want to show that this kind of computational framework is good at imitating people. Artoni and Magnani, on the other hand, just give a qualitative description of their theoretical model, and they don't implement it in a computer and show how it mimics the results of their experiment. Probably that would be too long for a talk at a conference anyway. They just want to show, here's how people behave, and here's what our theory looks like, and this is why we can probably predict these aspects of the people's behavior. So that's, going a little bit more in depth about why there's two studies and what the purposes of them are in the Kempe-McWhinney paper versus the Artoni and Magnani one, where they sort of have the same elements, but they don't give as much computational detail about how the model works. And then here's a really high level, not obvious at all observation. Why are the papers structured this way? Because researchers in computational modeling rarely consider a theoretical observation to be valid unless it comes with an actual computer implementation. If you're going to tell me that your Q-validity framework does better at predicting the data we've observed than some other framework, you better code the two of them as computer programs and show me that one of them does better. Otherwise, I don't believe your observations. Artoni and Magnani, on the other hand, are presenting at a conference devoted to an abstract syntactic formalism, LFG, where people are not going to expect that level of computational intensity in a paper like this. Usually in theoretical syntax, we're perfectly happy showing how a particular formal approach makes some particular predictions about the structure of sentences, and that, look, those broadly mirror what we find in the data. Right? Because Artoni and Magnani are at this very different disciplinary setting where they're at a syntax conference, they're not going to be expected to show a full computational implementation of their model versus Kempe and McWhinney, who are writing in a very technical and highly sort of computationally sophisticated peer-reviewed journal coming from this computational background, right? So that's a totally not obvious kind of thing that will still guide the way I'm reading these two papers, because as a professional researcher, I have all of this background about the structure of these two fields, and that helps me bring different kinds of knowledge to bear on how I'm reading the two papers. Here's another example. Kempe and McWhinney have much more material about how their studies were designed and carried out. Here's a sort of obvious reason why. Because peer-reviewed journals, especially Studies in Second Language Acquisition, which is a pretty prestigious big-name journal in applied linguistics, they're going to require more information about the details, the methods, the materials used in the study. Whereas in a conference proceedings, like, you should probably say something about how you carried the experiment out, but you're not going to need the same level of, excruciating detail about how you managed every aspect of experimental construction and data presentation and data collection, right? You're just not going to need the same level of detail in here. Here's a maybe more interesting observation. Why do Kempe and McWhinney describe their materials in such detail? Because they're really making an argument for one theoretical framework over another. And they have a very detailed computer program, computational implementation of one of those frameworks that makes a ton of detailed quantitative predictions. And so how you analyze the little fine details of the experiment are really crucially important in this paper. Whereas Artoni and Magnani are simply giving an argument that there exists some interesting way of explaining some aspects of case acquisition data, and they're not explicitly comparing this to another theoretical approach. They're just saying, look, this particular approach does some useful stuff. Right? So maybe it's not quite as important, given that we're mostly talking about the qualitative predictions of one theory. Maybe it's not as important to know every little tiny detail of what the people in Artoni and Magnani's study were actually presented with, just that they behaved broadly in this way, and our theory sort of broadly predicts that that should be true. And again, going above and beyond what's in the papers now and incorporating my knowledge of the field as a professional, I'm also thinking these thoughts as I'm looking at the two papers. And again, this is not something I expect you guys to have 3 weeks into your first semester here, but it's just an illustration of the ways that we might gather lots of knowledge over the course of years of reading research and feed that back into this process of connecting structure and content. So why do Kempe and McWhinney have so much more material about their studies? Well, because connectionist researchers like these two are much more concerned with quantitative variation in language than theoretical syntacticians are. And I spelled syntacticians wrong here, but that's meant to be the word syntacticians. And so, yeah, this is just a fact about the sociology of these two fields, where people who are doing connectionist implementations of foreign language learning theories are going to be concerned with little tiny quantitative details about how often people produce and process different forms. Theoretical syntacticians are going to be more interested in gross properties of the kinds of implicit knowledge we use to judge sentences or to judge how to produce a sentence, whether it's in a first language or a foreign language. Right? So again, there's different levels of concreteness and directness with regard to what's in the paper here. And hopefully the idea is that as we start out focusing on these more mechanical details down here, eventually, if we do this many times with many papers, we're going to start building up knowledge about the structure of the field and the reasons why people structure their research in the ways that they do. And this takes years of reading, right? So, but that said, even by the end of the semester, within the topic that you decide to work on, you're probably going to start amassing knowledge like this about, well, these papers always do this kind of thing, but these other kinds of papers work really differently. And here's my thought about why the two groups of researchers do things differently, right? You will get there with some practice. Here's what I thought about the structure. They're both pretty good. So a couple things I can think of. Neither one of them clearly sets off the introductory material from the rest. So Kempe and McWhinney just give an unnumbered series of background sections, and Artoni and Magnani have a special section that's called Introduction, but it only contains the roadmap for how the rest of the paper is going to look. It doesn't actually contain all the background information, and the actual background info is set off in separate unnumbered sections. That said, I mean, the relevant material for the introduction is present in both papers, so it's not that big a deal. It's not like they skipped all the background. They just sort of structured it a little differently than I was expecting. The lack of numbering kind of makes it hard to know exactly where we are in the papers. And so, yeah, it's often useful if you're breaking down section 1, the introduction, into section 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, so I know, hey, we've just gone through all the background on this topic, and now we're going to start a different background topic. That's useful, but you can definitely figure this out while you're reading the papers. Beyond that, both of the papers seem pretty well structured to me. I don't have a lot of objections to how they organize the sections or anything like that. And here's my opinions on content. Now again, this is going to involve me with years of experience and knowledge in being a professional linguist, having some very strong opinions on what they're saying in the two papers, right? But I don't expect this level of detail or even this level of having an opinion from you guys. I'm just more interested in some sort of reactions to what did you think of the two papers? I'm giving my, very serious, many years of research under my belt kind of assessment here, and I'm not expecting the same level of engagement or the same level of knowledge from my first year master's students, but it's supposed to be an example of a variety of different kinds of content that you might want to opine on. I think the Kempe and McWhinney paper from Studies in Second Language Acquisition, the peer-reviewed journal, I think that one's more compelling because they provide a lot more detail about both what are you proposing and about how they studied it. And that will make the study replicable. If I wanted to go out and see if I could recreate the results of the Kempe and McWhinney paper, I could plausibly do that with the information they gave me. Artoni and Magnani give a partial description of their theory and very little explanation of the methods they use to test it. It's some kind of a judgment or production tasks using second language learners, but you don't get a lot of details about what they actually did there. And so that's a big advantage of the Kempe-McWhinney paper. And then the other big one here is that Kempe and McWhinney explicitly consider alternative hypotheses. So we think that this data is best modeled with this connectionist approach, but you can imagine other people trying to take an approach that's more based on grammatical structure, and we're going to try to explicitly compare these two alternatives. And that's a really compelling way of investigating a research question. Whereas Artoni and Magnani, they don't consider alternatives. They just say, hey, we have a theory of syntax and we have a theory of processing, and when you put them together, they make these neat predictions about how foreign language learners might approach the Russian case system, and look, our data are broadly maybe consistent with what we predicted, which is cool, but it would be a little bit more convincing if they told us whether there are other ways of predicting those kinds of facts other than the specific theories that they're advancing here. All right, so I'd say the Kempe and McWhinney paper is probably more compelling as a piece of research. That said, I don't actually believe their conclusions, and here again is where we get into my prior beliefs from 20 years of being a linguist, where I have strong priors against these kinds of connectionist accounts, and I'll tell you the specific reasons why. If you're not understanding what the approaches are about, or you're not interested in this is not crucial for doing the assignment, but I wanted to do a very thorough job of completing my second assignment here. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about these different approaches to case systems, right? So first of all, Kempe and McWhinney don't actually give any details of how that grammar-based theory should be implemented or understood, right? So they give a very detailed computational implementation of their connectionist theory, but they just talk about the grammar-based theory in the introduction. They don't give any implementation of that. They just assert without any support that it predicts paradigm complexity is important and Q validity is not. And I find it pretty hard to believe that anybody who actually takes that grammatical approach would really predict that. I think that people who take the grammatical approach probably believe that Q validity is important as well, and I would want Kempe and McWhinney to explain in detail why the grammatical approach doesn't recognize Q validity in their opinion. Well, yeah, and that's just my prior, because I know people who work in grammar-based approaches, and I don't think any of them would predict that Q validity is not important for acquiring a foreign language case system. And then this is related to the question, why do you have this detailed computational model of the approach that you favor, the connectionist one, when you don't have a detailed computational model of the grammatical approach? Of course, your detailed computational model is going to make more detailed predictions about the experimental data, but you can't compare that to a different approach where you didn't let it have a computer program and you just sort of said, hey, and this one says this factor is important and the other one's not, right? That's not a fair comparison. So I'd minimally need to see an implementation of the other approach before I believe your argument that your approach is superior. And then here's going even further into stuff that's not in the paper, but is in my understanding of linguistics as a field. I don't think connectionist approaches are coherent as models of human mental capacity at all, or at least not for linguistic human cognition. Why is that? Well, because connectionist approaches basically say that you learn two things are related to one another by experiencing situations in the world where they're related, and you use those relations to govern all of your generalizations about novel phenomena. And these models, these connectionist approaches, can model absolutely anything. So this is actually the kind of technology that even decades later underlies at a basic level most of the computational kinds of things that we engage with on a day-to-day basis. So for instance, Google Translate is based at some level on connectionist approaches. If you've heard of deep learning and modern artificial intelligence technology, this is almost all based on connectionist approaches. And it's true that these models are, extremely impressive in the range of things that they're able to process and predict. In fact, you could say that they can predict almost anything, these connectionist models, But the problem is that the things they can predict include a lot of things that humans don't actually do. Right? If you've ever played around with Google Translate in a detailed way, you know that it is unlike any human translator in a number of ways. It can still be quite useful, right? But it's doing things that people don't actually do when they think or when they use language. And then I would go even further and say that these connectionist approaches don't actually explain data in terms of constructs. All they do is mimic the data numerically and call it an explanation, right? So you take a bunch of numbers as input, and then you change the connectionist model so that it produces similar numbers as output. And then you say, look, I explained human behavior. But that's not really an explanation. It's just sort of restating the data that went into the model in the first place. So those would be my critiques of their general approach rather than their specific implementation of it. But that's my take on it. What would I do differently? I would try to organize the introduction sections a bit more transparently. I already talked about that a bit. And then my bigger overarching critique here is that for both of these papers, I would definitely add a section trying to explain how these findings relate to language teaching. Right? It's sort of weird that neither paper really has anything to say about this beyond sort of general statements like, the results have consequences for classroom teaching of languages with complex case systems. Right, but what are those consequences and why would it help with some particular teaching task? Neither of them really mentions that. And both papers seem to assume that second language acquisition is mainly interesting because it teaches us about other areas of human cognition. Right? In particular, both papers seem to implicitly assume that if we find particular models work well for second language acquisition, then that should also inform whether we think those models are right for first language or native language competence. Right? So in particular, I take the Campion-McWhinney paper to be arguing that this connectionist approach is great for second language acquisition, but also that it's going to be preferred for modeling native language knowledge, that connectionist approaches to first language competence are also better. And similarly, Artoni and Magnani, they're showing that this LFG, particular function of theory of syntax, is good for explaining these second language facts, and that seems to implicitly mean to them that that increases its plausibility as a theory of first language syntax or native language syntax. And LFG, as a theory of syntax, was explicitly developed as a theory of native language syntax. They're extending it to the second language context. But that said, neither of them really argue this explicitly, and I see no reason to believe that second language acquisition is fundamentally the same as first language acquisition. In fact, I can think of several reasons to be skeptical. Acquiring a foreign language as an adult is very, very different than acquiring a first language as an infant or as a child in many, many different ways, and you can't just assume that because something works this way in SLA, it's also going to work the same in native language linguistics. That's just not a valid assumption. So if that's right, and in fact the human cognitive mental mechanisms that underlie foreign language acquisition are just fundamentally different from native language acquisition, if that's right, then it's not clear to me that there's really a lot of use for SLA papers that have nothing to say about teaching. Right? If that's true, that SLA doesn't teach us much about how native languages are acquired, then presumably the main reason to study second language acquisition is because it's useful to try to teach people languages, and we might learn something about this from studying second language acquisition. So a paper that has no bearing on actual teaching, that talks only about SLA facts, to me is not necessarily a very valuable paper. And that's sort of my final take on what I would want to be different about these papers. So again, I'm not assuming that everybody in the class is going to have 20 years of background in the field and is going to be giving this level of critique, but I wanted to illustrate a range of possible things you might address in this homework assignment, from more basic to less basic to totally not basic, stuff I don't expect you to know yet, but just to sort of give you not just an overview of how to do the homework, but an overview of why. Eventually, this kind of knowledge is going to build, and you're going to have a lot of your own knowledge to bring into reading the structure and the content of any particular paper. So that's my demo of the second homework assignment.